Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can see and hear us properly. Welcome to the Clean Economy Alliance webinar series, and thanks for joining us. My name is Sarah Buchanan, and I am the coordinator for the Clean Economy Alliance, which is a multi-sector coalition of over 100 organizations, including clean tech firms, health advocates, businesses, environmental groups, and labor unions from across Ontario. So today we'll be discussing Ontario's new plan to address climate change, and we'll be zeroing in on a $350 million emissions reduction fund called the Ontario Carbon Trust. So that this fund will use public funds to leverage private investment in climate solutions in Ontario. And today we're going to explore how this fund could be structured for maximum climate impact, as well as some lessons learned from other jurisdictions who've tried a similar approach. So we want to explore more the idea of using public money to leverage private investment. And we want to talk about some ideas for how Ontario can do this well, how they can structure the fund to make sure it has the maximum impact. And knowing that this fund was influenced by Australia's emissions reductions fund to address climate change, we've also brought in a speaker who can give us an overview of some lessons learned from Australia and other jurisdictions as well, which could be applied to Ontario. So joining us today, we have a few guests. We have Julia Langer, who is the CEO of the Atmospheric Fund. Julia leads TAF in advancing the organization's solutions to climate and air pollution, and with support from TAF's investment committee, oversees the fiscal integrity of TAF's endowment. So TAF has a lot of experience investing in solutions to reduce carbon emissions and air pollution, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Julia to share some of that wisdom. Keith Brooks, who is here next to me, is the program's director at Environmental Defence, and he's going to give us a quick overview of the climate actions proposed by the Ontario government in the Environment Plan, so we can put the Ontario Carbon Trust in perspective. And Justin Johnson is going to be joining us. He is the International Emissions Trading Association, or IETA. He's their RGGI representative, which means that he tracks and analyzes RGGI policies along the East Coast in the US. And he previously served as Vermont's Secretary of Administration and was an RGGI board member for 7 years. A native Australian, he also served as Chief of Staff to a member of the Australian Federal Parliament for almost 4 years. So if you have any questions during this presentation, you can type it into the Q&A box on your control panel. And you can feel free to type it in during the presentation, and we'll leave time at the end of each speaker's portion to address some of those questions. And I also want to remind everyone quickly that you can still submit comments on Ontario's Environment Plan. That is open until the end of day on January 28th, next Monday. And so we hope that this webinar will help inform your comments. I'm going to hand it over to you, Keith, to talk a little bit about the climate actions in Ontario's new climate plan.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I know this webinar is really about the Carbon Trust, but we thought we should just give a brief overview of the Environment Plan. Not sure how many people have had a chance to look at it, but yeah, we thought it was worth kind of outlining some of what's there. I would say, off the top, that the plan is quite short on details, actually. I think it was kind of rushed out the door late in 2018, mostly because the government needed to have a plan in hand so they could challenge the federal government in moving forward and bringing a price on carbon here in Ontario. So the plan, as you probably know, does not include carbon pricing, but it does include a bunch of other initiatives. And it's not just a climate change plan either. It's a Made in Ontario Environment Plan. So it begins by talking about actions to deal with air pollution, which is something that this government has spoken about, but the actions are a lot about monitoring. They're about monitoring pollution, roadside monitoring. They seem to be about, a testing program for heavy-duty vehicles, but not a lot of actions about actually reducing emissions or reducing pollution. I know I'm going to focus mostly on the climate, but I have to say the plan talks a lot about clean water, another priority this government has put out there. but it essentially promises the status quo here that, Ontario is going to renegotiate the Canada-Ontario agreement with the federal government. It talks about Ontario's Great Lakes strategy and the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, and talks about working with Indigenous communities to clean up the mercury contamination in the English Wabigoon system, and talks about Ontario's source water protection plans, which I bring up because it's a bit, there's some contrast between what is in the environmental plan and what is in the government's Bill 66, which essentially allows municipalities to override all of these provincial plans. And I don't mean the environment plan, but the Greenbelt plan, source water protection plans, those kind of plans. So there's some tension there between the environmental plan and Bill 66, which I think is worth acknowledging. So on to climate change. This plan it's a step backward from where we were in Ontario. The plan really does mention the rising costs of extreme weather in Ontario. It's, averaging about $400 million a year. And it doesn't shy away from making a link between extreme weather and climate change, but then it doesn't actually commit to actions to deal with climate change on the same level that might be expected.
Oh, we just had a question about the slides. There's no slides for the first few minutes of the presentation, so don't worry. You're just seeing our faces on camera right now. That's as it's supposed to be. We'll get onto the slides in a few minutes.
On climate, it talks up a lot of the actions that were actually taken by the previous government, mainly the phase out of coal-fired electricity, and essentially argues that Ontario has done enough to reduce emissions already, and that the province is now going to strive to meet the federal Paris targets of 30% below 2005 by 2030. So this is in comparison to the previous target, which was 37% below 1990 levels by 2030. And to put this all into context, the difference between the new target and the old target is about 30 megatons, which is the same amount of emissions that were reduced by the phase out of coal in Ontario. So it's a significant difference, significant deviation from the previous targets. Also of note, the old targets were legislated. They were contained in a piece of legislation. The new targets are not. So that's important there. In terms of actions, the plan has quite a bit on adaptation and has a big section on building resilience. It promises an assessment of climate impacts in Ontario, which I think is a good thing to do, actually. We can size up the risks of extreme weather and the other impacts that climate change is having in Ontario. That should make a case for more aggressive action in the future, I hope. It talks about an online tool to help people understand those impacts as well. It talks about modernizing the building code, and there's a part about the building code in the mitigation section as well, but in the adaptation section, that's really about kind of resilience for buildings. It talks about a review of the Municipal Disaster Recovery Assistance Program, and it mentions this program's paid out $2.6 million since its founding in 2016. So I don't know whether that means that they are planning to reduce that fund because it's already costing too much. It's not clear why they mentioned how much is paid out. It talks about tax policies to encourage homeowners to protect their homes from extreme weather and a few other actions on resilience. On mitigation, they actually have added two charts to show how Ontario is going to reduce emissions. One is one of the kind of a stacked wedge diagram showing the different actions on top of each other and how these are going to drive down Ontario's new targets. The other one is a pie chart that shows where emissions reductions are going to come from, and they're going to come from a few places. So one is low carbon vehicles. Primarily, the plan talks about a switch to electric cars. This despite the fact that we don't have an incentive anymore for electric cars, and in fact, Metrolinx, you might have seen in the news, is tearing up old electric vehicle charging stations and some other things. So there's a question about whether we're going to meet that that target around low carbon vehicles. Talks about industry performance standards, which I'm going to say something about in a minute as well. There's a big part on clean fuels, which is both increasing the ethanol content in Ontario's gasoline, and also it counts the impact of the federal clean fuel standard. Interesting that it doesn't count the federal impact or impact of other federal policies like carbon pricing, for example, in Ontario. It talks about natural gas conservation, commits to natural gas conservation, which is good, something we've been flagging for them a lot, and we want to see that there. Low carbon trust, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It has a place for other policies, which include investment in transit and waste diversion, but it doesn't really give any more details on the other policies. And then And then the final wedge is innovation, when it just talks about potential investments in the future into energy storage and other fuel switching stuff. So I think that they went to the effort of building this chart, but we should be skeptical of the chart. I don't think that they could know how much emissions reductions are going to come from these different policies, because it's really short on details. It looks kind of like back of the napkin math. And then on the industry performance standards, I really hope that I don't put too much stock in them, and I hope that the government doesn't spend too much time consulting on them, because on January 1st, the federal government's output-based pricing system is now applying in Ontario. So this is pricing for those large industrial emitters, and I find it difficult to believe that the provincial government is going to regulate them on top of carbon pricing brought in from the federal government. So it was kind of put up there as a challenge to say this is our approach to industry emissions and we don't need the federal approach, but the federal approach is now in place and will be there until 2022. So I don't imagine that emitters are going to be regulated twice here in Ontario. There's a few other financial pieces I'll just touch on that might be interesting to folks, especially who are interested in this low carbon trust. They talk about working with the financial sector to promote climate-related risk disclosures, and they talk about working with the Ontario Securities Commission to improve guidance on that front. They talk about making some changes to accelerated capital cost allowance on clean energy projects to make the financing easier there, and they talk about some green bonds and looking at tax policy changes as well. One piece for CEA members, they do mention home energy ratings. We've had a piece before. We were trying to get the government to put in mandatory home energy ratings for houses when they're sold. They've now made this voluntary. So if you want to disclose how efficient your home is when you sell it, or you can do that voluntarily. There's some more details on the efficiency stuff in the plan. It commits $5 billion more for subways and for relief lines, but we're not sure $5 billion more than what. And it talks about reducing waste, which is a good thing to do, of course, and will reduce emissions as well. And then it talks about protecting the green belt. It talks about parks and all that kind of stuff. So that's a very high-level overview of the plan. Maybe if the questions go there at the end, we could talk more on it. It is pretty short on details. It doesn't offer up much in the way of actions. It's less ambitious than the previous government's targets. And I think the math is really of the back of the napkin variety.
Mm-hmm. So if anybody has any questions for Keith, you can either pop them in the Q&A section right now, or you can also save them for the end of the webinar, and Keith will be available then. If you have any general questions for any of the speakers, we're going to have time at the end of the webinar. And I don't see any new questions right now. So we're going to move on over to Julia Langer, who's the CEO of the Atmospheric Fund. And we're going to let her give an overview of the Ontario Carbon Trust, what we know right now, as well as what some things we'd like to see in the future. And Julia, I'm just going to turn on your video here. Okay, so.
Great, and do you have my presentation up?
It is
okay,
up.
Great. Good, thank you. Glad to be participating in this webinar, and we're members of the Clean Economy Alliance and have participated in a few of these great webinars where we try to sort of share amongst the alliance, and financing is, as Sarah mentioned, one of the big areas that TAF really focuses in on, and I hope I can share some insights. I sort of put this presentation together based on discussion with members of my team, including Tim Stout, who's our VP of Impact Investing, and Brian Purcell, who's the Head of Policy and Programs and works on our TerraWise retrofit program. So, okay, it says start my video. I don't think I've got video, so I'll just carry on here. The Ontario Carbon Trust, as Keith mentioned, is a big part, is a small part, but has gotten a lot of kind of airtime in the context of the climate plan or the environmental plan. And so I wanted to unpack some of that just in order to give some depth in terms of some of the tools that are available. And can someone take maybe I can take it out myself. I don't know how to take out this Oh, maybe there we go. I think you all know a bit about TAF. We've been around since 1991. It's all, we're all about the urban climate solutions and air pollution reduction. And so, as I mentioned, financing is a big piece of our work, since we have an endowment and we do invest directly in this space. So I'm not getting any movement on my slides. Hang on a sec. Page down. Oops. How do I do this? I'm sorry, everybody. Okay, here we go. So the Ontario Carbon Trust that's been proposed is, if you look at the pie chart that's in the document, it's the tiny little wedge that talks about, that says 4%, that it will contribute to 4% of emission reductions. And this kind of caught our eye because we feel that a huge amount of capital is going to be needed to make a transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy, and that public funds, such as what would flow through the Ontario Carbon Trust, need to be used in a very strategic way, and that is to crowd in private capital. There is simply not enough public capital on the planet to make that transition. And it also needs to be used, because it's public funds, to deliver climate solutions as well as co-benefits. So we need to maximize the opportunity from using public funds in a very strategic way. And we have very few details about the Ontario Carbon Trust in that plan. I think it's kind of the same as many of the other elements, very few details. So, here's the opportunity for us to give some recommendations and put some thought into how it could be used, how this fund could be effective. So I've broken it down into 4 types of recommendations. One is all about leverage, so using the funds strategically to bring private capital into the low carbon economy and achieve those carbon reductions that we need. Avoid free ridership, which is a big mistake that often happens with public funds. We need to go deeper. We need to go faster on carbon reduction, and so there's ways that you can use financing to make that happen. And finally, we need more investment and more ambition for this tool, as well as all of the other tools in that pie chart. So just to delve a bit deeper into this, what do we mean by leveraging private capital? So the way it's proposed right now, there would be actually 350 million, but I'm saying 400 million for a very specific reason, which has to do with the 50 million that was proposed for the reverse auction, which we don't really think is very effective. So we're proposing that there be 400 million at a 1-to-4 leverage, which is what is sort of mentioned in the plan. That could mean a total investment of about 2 billion over 4 years. And this is totally doable with a combination of financial tools and offerings. So, we don't see that there's any challenge to doing that. You could leverage it up a bit farther, but then again, leverage isn't everything, and we're sort of concerned about over leveraging. So the most important thing to consider when you're leveraging is that you're also getting catalytic potential. So it's using public funds and bringing in funds to do things that aren't otherwise being done, that we're building business capacity to do more of this over time, and that we deliver community benefits, because this is what's going to make things sticky. If you just give away, and put money into things that only have business benefits and not community benefits, then you don't build that sort of public engagement and support and value proposition, which is going to make for durable climate policy. The second recommendation is about going deeper faster and making the Ontario Carbon Trust a barrier busting tool. And what we mean by that is be very specific about what is stopping investment from flowing into low carbon solutions now, and use this public funding to open up those opportunities. And so examples of this and the kinds of the mix of strategies that could be used is, for instance, specialized loans or warehousing facilities. So if you've got a lot of small scale projects like single family retrofits or even multi-unit building retrofits, these are kind of small enough scale that most of the the bigger investors aren't interested in them, and then they have challenges accessing affordable capital. So if you have specially designed financing for those types of projects, then that will accelerate the volume and build scale. And another really high leverage and effective way of using public dollars is as credit enhancement. So those can be things like loan guarantees or performance insurance, things that de-risk what are considered risky projects by conventional lenders. And generally, this is very cheap to implement. You can match this up 5-to-1 or 10-to-1. And what it also does is builds let's call it the banks or the bigger financial institutions, it builds their familiarity with these projects. It convinces them that they're not as risky as they might have otherwise perceived, and therefore they can reduce the cost of financing over time. And then, of course, there's grants and incentives. And our complaint has often been that government provides free money, so just grants, in a way that is not at all leveraged. And so, for instance, for retrofits where there is a return on investment, they shouldn't be providing 100% financing or free or grants or free money, but they should require a match, so a 1-to-1 match. Or to go deeper faster, what we can do is that government money, so from the carbon trust, could be for things that have a longer term payback and leave commercial financing for the shorter term payback things. It's just a way of matching up financing and grants to get more bang for the buck. A third key thing that needs to be a principle of the Ontario Carbon Trust, and for that matter, any government financing, is to avoid free ridership. And this, we keep hearing about the lowest cost per ton. It's the wrong approach when you're trying to be barrier busting. And also you need to avoid super high leverage. So if you got 10-to-1 leverage, it probably means that 1% would have happened anyways. And so why should we have put public funds into it? And on that note, I would come back to my point about why we talked about 400 million. The 50 million proposed for the reverse auction is kind of the classic example of lowest cost per ton approach, very, very high leverage. And we feel that it should just quietly be rolled into the overall carbon trust. So in other words, well, we'll hear from our next presenter about, whether this is an approach to take or not. We certainly feel that there's better ways to use that funding. And then our fourth recommendation is about increasing investment and ambition. So only 4% of the targeted carbon reductions from this fund, the 400 million, let's call it 400 million over 4 years, is way short of what's needed, what's possible, even when it's leveraged up. And frankly, it's 90% less than the now canceled cap and trade program, right? The reduction in availability of public funding to stimulate and accelerate has just been dramatically reduced. So, that's certainly a basic metric that needs to be adjusted. So overall message is about design the Ontario Carbon Trust for impact. Look at all the ways that we can use public money to bust barriers, accelerate results, avoid that free ridership, and in fact just get more public dollars doing that work into the mix. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Julia. And we do have a couple of questions for you here. I have one that just popped up, and it is the first question, actually the question that popped up in the chat was asking for you to go into more detail about why specifically the lowest cost per ton approach is the wrong approach.
The real, the short answer is that generally those are the things that happen anyways. And so, you know, I mean, if you absolutely the lowest cost approach in a given, for a given measure is still not, you know, economic or cost effective, you know, because it's super leading edge and it's, you know, it's least cost within its class, then, you know, I guess, yeah, go for that particular least cost. But in an energy efficiency context, or whether that's residential or commercial or industrial, or in the renewables, I mean, the lowest cost is generally what's happening in the marketplace. And so the opportunity for public funds is to stimulate the next tranche so that we can go faster and farther.
Okay, and there's one more question for you, Julia. Do you have any ideas for criteria to allow low-income communities to access carbon trust funds?
So this is where the combination of financing and grants and incentives really works. So for instance, TAF is financing social housing retrofits, and we're doing that on a non-debt basis. We can also see the value proposition of having a grant where there's a matching requirement. So basically to bring in 2 sources of capital and stack them up, or even 3 because you have utility incentives. So, or you have the public dollars available for longer term payback items and financing, you know, maybe a low interest loan for the 1 to 7 year payback items. So it's about using the right money for the right ROI. And in social housing, a combination of grants, incentives, and financing properly structured can actually allow the whether it's a cooperative or community housing, city housing, to really get those efficiency, to optimize their energy efficiency. And it's a great opportunity to put it all together.
And one more question just popped up here for you, Julia. What opportunities are available for distributed ledger technology on either reporting CO2 emissions securely or for facilitating investment in clean energy in a more efficient manner?
I'm not sure I understand what the distributed ledger technology is, but
okay, no worries. We can leave that open for any panelist at the end who wants to answer it, perhaps. Distributed ledger technology is blockchains, clarifies our question answer.
Oh, okay. Well, the point is, how are you, let's say blockchain or whatever, distributed ledger technology, that is a method for contracting, for establishing the contracts and the roles and responsibilities. I mean, this is another question about whether government has the capacity to do financing with excellence. And, a lot of their contracting, is very ponderous. If there are mechanisms to actually make it easier and faster and cheaper, maybe we can sort of leaven that in. I haven't looked at the sort of implementation, but it is an important question as to, like public sector organizations tend to be, not very nimble or business-like about how they do transactions. And, I guess it's a big underlying challenge about whether a government can actually even operate something like the Ontario Carbon Trust in a way that meets these kinds of objectives.
Thank you, Julia, for that for those insights. Again, that was Julia Langer, the CEO of the Atmospheric Fund, and I'm actually going to pop back over to Keith here because we had one more question generally on the environment plan, and that was from Andrea, and it is any insights on the timelines for implementation of different sections of the plan. I'm going to actually try to turn our camera back on over here as well.
So the plan is up on the environmental registry right now. That's the site that the environmental commissioner manages, and you can give comment to that. The Clean Economy Alliance will be commenting. Did we send around a draft of that yet, Sarah?
It's going to come in about an hour, actually.
Okay, in an hour. So we're going to be sending around a draft. It's short, and it's a reiteration of things that the Clean Economy Alliance has said in the past about the plan, and really speaks to the need to have science-based targets and more ambition and whatnot. But anyway, that plan is up there, and they're taking comments on that. So you can go up and comment, or you can sign under this Clean Economy Alliance one as well. They say that they've identified a bunch of priority initiatives in the plan. Some of those are already underway, and the plan says they will begin implementation on the remaining initiatives following consultation. So sometime soon, but they don't give specific timelines on that. But there are a couple pieces that are moving now, one of which is the heavy-duty vehicle emissions testing. There was a consultation earlier, I guess last week actually, about that. So that piece is moving. We think there's some consultations beginning around some of the waste stuff in the plan. There have been some discussions around water takings as well already in Ontario. And then I think that they are talking about the industry performance standards, although I don't know, again, how detailed the conversation is going to get, because we have the output-based pricing system in Ontario, and I can't imagine that large entities want to be double regulated. So
I think there will be a consultation on the performance standards for large industry. I don't think there's dates yet, but
yeah, they've talked about doing that stuff. So I mean, they're going to get moving on the different pieces over time, we would imagine.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't see any more questions at the moment, but again, if anyone has questions at any point, just type it into your Q&A panel. You can also type things into the chat panel that you want to go to the panelists or other participants as well. So now I'm going to head over to Justin Johnson, and I'm going to unmute you, Justin, and I think that maybe you still have your microphone on mute, and I'm going to get you to start your video as well and hand it over to you to tell us a little bit more about the Australian system, as well as some lessons learned from all the other sectors and jurisdictions that you have worked in.
Okay, the system's telling me that you need to turn on my video.
Okay, great. I'm going to do that up here, and here we are. Okay. So I've had it ask you to start your video. Why don't you start? There you go. Bam. We're good.
Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. Just a little bit about me, just so you know where I'm coming from. I live in Vermont in the northeast US, buried under snow, like I understand you are today as well. And I work for, I'm a consultant, but I do some work for the International Emissions Trading Association, mainly covering RGGI and the other sort of northeast climate proposals and policies. We split up the California stuff from the stuff that's happening over here in the northeast, just because they're sort of equally active but quite different. So I do a lot of work for AIDA. Anyway, in a previous life, I grew up in Australia, and I worked for the Howard government in Australia, which I guess is like saying you worked for the Harper government in Canada. But I spent a number of years working as a chief of staff to a federal member of parliament there. And as it happens, my cousin is the federal opposition leader there, Bill Shorten. So, but anyway, so I follow this stuff fairly closely and have done a little bit of work in Australia. And I want to sort of preface the piece about the the National Energy Guarantee and the Emissions Reduction Fund that we're talking about here, just to give you a little sense of how we got here. Back in the mid-2000s, when Julia Gillard was the Prime Minister in Australia, as you probably know, Australia almost had an emissions trading system, and it was pretty close to being linked to the European emissions trading system. That is, they had a price on carbon. It was set for the first 3 years, and then it was going to be floated essentially as a trading system, and at that point connected to the European ETS. Part of the reason for that was because Australia is so small, such a small economy, and the opportunity for the lowest cost carbon reductions was seen to only happen if we could expand the size of the market and add liquidity and that sort of thing. So that meant joining the EU ETS, which was the only game in town. All that started to fall apart on the 1st of December 2009 when Tony Abbott won a party room vote to become Prime Minister by 1 vote. He beat, at the time, opposition leader Malcolm Turnbull, who had done a deal with the Labor Party to actually, with some amendments, have this whole EU, have this ETS policy pass in Parliament. And I only mention all that because that 1 vote sort of changed the course of the Australian approach to environment or carbon reduction policy. Subsequently, Tony Abbott won the election. The emissions trading system was scrapped. It was replaced with a thing called the National Energy Guarantee, which was focused on both the carbon intensity of energy, but also on energy security and supply, with a much more of a focus on security and supply, and intensity came last. And the whole idea of carbon pricing was essentially scrapped at that point. And it was replaced with what was called a direct action plan. And this was a proposal whereby the state, or the country in this case, would put in funds, public funds, which would be used to directly reduce emissions by funding the lowest cost bids and proposals that were presented. And so a fund was set up called the Emissions Reduction Fund. It was $2.5 billion when it was first set up. It was a voluntary scheme, and it was to provide incentives to reduce emissions through new practices and technologies. What happened under the fund was you could bid to get what was called an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, which could be used to either you could either save that, you earn the unit by either storing or avoiding carbon, and then you could sell the units back to the government through a contract. Or they could be sold on the secondary market. So it created a weird system, but fundamentally the government was using public money to pay for emissions reductions. To ensure that the overall emissions in the economy were kept at or below the existing level, a thing called the safeguard mechanism was set up, which essentially kept large businesses it set their emissions on a baseline at historic levels. And I might just quickly cover the safeguard mechanism. And, well, I should take a step back. I think that as a sort of case study of how these things work, the Australian example to date is a great example of what not to do. And I'll just touch on some of the reasons why. And essentially, the opposite would be perhaps some of the things to do. And so we'll come back to that. But the safeguard mechanism, the first part of this, the businesses that were covered by it were required to keep their emissions at or below a baseline set by the Clean Energy Regulator, which was a federal government regulator set up for this purpose. And it applied to facilities with direct emissions of more than 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. Electric generation, mining, oil and gas, transportation, manufacturing, waste, construction. Collectively, the covered emissions under the safeguard mechanism covered 50% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. The problem, and here's the first lesson in all of this, the baseline, and I'll quote the language, may be adjusted to accommodate economic growth, natural resources variability, and other circumstances where historic emissions are not representative of future business as usual emissions performance for the facility. So the safeguard mechanism has a huge loophole in it. That is, you can adjust, and these industries that are involved in it have adjusted it fairly regularly. So that's the first thing. If you're going to have a backstop, a safeguard mechanism, whatever you want to call it, it needs to be solid, and this one is not. So we'll start with that. The second thing I'd say, so going back to the emissions reduction fund, part of the challenge with the emissions reduction fund is the previous speaker talked about leveraging private funds, and you certainly could under the emissions reduction fund that Australia has, but there is no requirement to leverage private funds. It's essentially a completely publicly funded effort. And as has been pointed out by Julia, and I would absolutely agree with her, there simply is not enough public money available to deal with this challenge. It's not going to happen. And so we have to leverage private money and encourage private money and recognize that until private capital moves into this space, we are not going to get the fundamental change in investment that we need to make these things happen. And to that point, the $2.5 billion fund has currently committed $1.9 billion. It is actually paid out only about $396 million, and that's in part because the time frame for the contracts that you could bid on is broad. So remaining in the fund of $2.5 billion is about $249 million. So the fund has essentially been spent, and there's currently a conversation going on in Australia about whether to sort of recapitalize the fund for another number of years. And we'll find out in May when the federal budget is handed down whether that actually happens. But it brings me to the second thing I would say about these types of programs. If you're going to have an emissions reduction fund or some other public funding source that either drives this investment on its own or leverages private investment, you have to have some certainty and consistency about how it's funded. Because what they have in Australia right now, they have a budget that's due in May, they have a federal election that's due in May, the fund is out of money, and there is no certainty that it'll get recapitalized, and if it does, whether it even exists or in what form it exists going forward. And so the idea of bringing in any kind of private funds on the back of what's in the public purse here is just not happening, because no one has any idea what's going to happen next. And so that, I think, is a really important thing. You've got to work out how to make this fund consistent and there's got to be a plan for the future, and investors have got to know where the money's coming from, when it's going to come, and have confidence that it's actually going to happen. This is backed up by the fact at the moment that the current government in Australia maintains that the Australia's Paris commitment will be met, and yet none of the actual sort of statistics or evidence would show that that's actually going to happen. So there's a real disconnect between reality and policy here. And I think, and I'll get into some of the other pieces about the fund in a moment, but the fundamental challenge with this fund is it does not really price carbon in any meaningful way. The 50% of the emissions that are covered by the guarantee by the by the safeguard mechanism, the industries that are covered by that safeguard mechanisms have not applied for any of the money in the emissions reduction fund, in part because they haven't had any pressure to do so. So right now, just to give you a sense of the fund itself, the money has gone into some landfill projects, agriculture, energy efficiency, a little bit of transportation, some revegetation projects, and avoidance of the burning of savanna, which is the sort of grassland burning. Where the money has gone more specifically is, as I said, they've had some reductions in the emissions in the carbon intensity of transportation. That's mainly the conversion to electric. Commercial and industrial energy efficiency, which is lighting in large part, and insulation, weatherization, capture and combustion of landfill gas and ag wastes, and the capture and combustion of biogas and wastewater, increasing the level of soil carbon, cover cropping and no-till drilling, that sort of thing, reforestation and plantings, and reduction in livestock emissions. This is where they've spent most of the money. And to date, of the 429 contracts that have been let or have been approved over the last 7 auctions, 16 of them have actually been completed and fully paid out. So it's been fairly slow. And that is in the last 4 years. So I think that part of the challenge there is the contracts. The delivery schedule on the contracts is between 1 and 10 years. So many of them have got 3 or 4 or 5 more years before they actually have to deliver. And the auction itself, the decision about which of these bids gets funded is entirely based on the cost. So it's a reverse auction, single bid, sealed sort of tender approach. The lowest bid wins and automatically enters into a carbon abatement contract, and price is the only criteria in the auction. And so I think that the challenges in all of this have been, and it's open, I should say, to individuals, sole traders, companies, local, state and territory governments. You apply, you register a project, it gets approved as a project that meets the criteria, and then you get to bid in the auction. The challenge in all that is it's been very cumbersome. The process of going through the application and approval of the project before you even get to the auction is fairly long and cumbersome, and has a high transactional cost. It's expensive and time consuming, involves a lot of auditing, and then one of the major sectors, emission sectors in Australia, electricity generation is exempted from the project. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a real lack of long-term stability and policy certainty. So all in all, and the price across the 7 or 8 auctions now has been averaged around $11.97 Australian is what the bid prices have been. But the biggest problem, I think, is that because it's voluntary and it's only based on price, there has been no, and this, I guess, is another sort of takeaway, there's been no strategy around it. There's been no saying which are the industries and the activities that we most need to put investment into. And hence you get a lot of money spent on the avoidance of burning grasses and things like that at a time when that may or may not, actually probably isn't the most effective place to spend the money. So I would say, just to sort of wrap this up, there is certainly an opportunity for this type of direct, what they call direct action investment. I think the way that it's been done in Australia, and I'll be a little cynical about this, the whole structure was to avoid having a set carbon price, and has, I think you would be hard-pressed to find any meaningful improvement in carbon emissions based on the spending of $2.5 billion in taxpayers' money. I would mention that New Zealand, our friends right across the Tasman, have set up their own green investment fund. It's $100 million New Zealand. It's set up to leverage private investments. It is focused on manufacturing processes, electrification of transportation, efficiency in commercial buildings and farming. And it left electricity generation out because they believe that that's well enough capitalised. It's yet to be seen how well that one works out, but the fact that they want to use the public money to leverage private investment, I think, is a really good start and something that Australia really needs to look at. And given that the election there is coming, a federal election is coming up in May, I think there'll be a lot of tough questions asked about what happens with the Emissions Reduction Fund, which to date has not delivered on the emissions savings that the government has argued that it would. And I think, you know, if you had $2.5 billion in public money to spend, there's better ways to spend it. So why don't I just stop there for a moment.
Thanks, Justin. I wanted to, first of all, remind everyone that you're welcome to ask a question of Justin or Julia or Keith or any of the speakers, really, if you pop it into the Q&A section. And Justin, I also wanted to ask one specific question. Julia mentioned in her presentation that she recommended that the $50 million that's now bound for a reverse auction be actually rolled into the broader Ontario Carbon Trust, to turn that $350 million into $400 million. Do you think it would be more effective? Do you agree with that suggestion?
I do. I think that, first of all, $50 million is not a lot of money in the overall scheme of things. And so I think that by having 400 million instead of 350 is a really, I mean, the bigger you can make that pot, the more leverage ultimately you can get. I guess the one caveat is that I think that any public money that's spent really has to, I mean, there has to be a strong leverage with private money. Julia pointed this out, that sometimes the government is not the best organisation to work out where to spend this money, and I think that's true. And so I think that it is most efficient and the best use of the money to sort of follow the private money, but in a way where, say, the private money would go there if it could, it just needed a little boost to get there. I think that relying on the public money to lead the way can sometimes lead to some fairly screwy outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we were also, thinking more broadly about where that extra money, like what kind of projects that extra money would be best to invest in. You mentioned some of the projects in Australia that maybe hadn't had a very big impact or weren't as effective as they had hoped. Where do you think would be a better place for those funds? And I'll open it up, Julia. I'm going to unmute you if you have any suggestions as well for Ontario on where that money specifically, what kind of projects could go. I know you mentioned a few possibilities in your presentation, but I'll just open it up here.
Yeah, and just quickly, I think that really depends on the bigger structure of the approach, because if it's about encouraging private capital to enter a sector or a specific activity, then it doesn't make any sense to fund things that already have good access to capital. And that's slightly different than just investing your money in the absolute sort of biggest bang for the buck projects. Because in Australia, for instance, all the really big emission projects, the most likely ones, the people covered under the backstop, they haven't actually participated in this approach at all. And the ones that have, in some cases, I think the capital has been helpful, although I don't see that they've brought in any private money. They've just been burning through the public money. So I think for me, the idea is to find projects that have significant emissions reductions potential, but need some kind of extra capital to make them happen.
Mm-hmm. I would agree, and a couple of points. So we don't have to look very much farther than our own emission inventory to know where our carbon emissions come from in Ontario. And then when you segment there, so buildings, transportation, large industry, and to a certain extent waste. So what are the things that are already moving along, or maybe need to be accelerated, and what kind of whether grant incentive and or specialized financing would help that move along bigger, faster? What is really not getting any, where is there like off-the-shelf technology, no technological barrier, but the business case seems risky, that's where you could have some intervention. This is the barrier busting I talk about for the Ontario Carbon Trust. And so, and I think about it in the context of the atmospheric fund and then what's next. So our role in the ecosystem tends to be sort of that innovation, demonstration, de-risking. So, we have a $48 million asset. We can do some, we've done 30 odd energy efficiency retrofits. And so we think it's ready for the next phase for a more sort of commercial treatment. And that's where you could get some scale in terms of, I would say we need more than 400 million, but, some better scale. What about in the waste management realm? Everybody talks about, using the methane gas to make electricity. The technology is off the shelf. What does that need? So I think we need to be super strategic about where we place that money and not just let random, I think I've got a really low cost project initiatives come forward and get selected, and it's not strategic. It's not opening up market opportunities. It's not making things investable by others. So that's the sort of tactical matching up the financing tools and those strategies with the emission sources that need some help to move along.
Yeah. So we have one last question here, and we've only got a couple minutes left. So this is for any panelist, but I'm going to ask you to be brief because we only have a couple minutes left. Any ideas for how to avoid use of money on projects that would have happened anyway?
Well, that is very much the point about free ridership. So there's a couple of approaches. One is don't over leverage, right? So, this is where we see the reverse auction being a problem. You're basically probably funding, maybe, I don't know, either 100% or 10%. Either way, it's either something that would have happened, or they're just throwing it in there because they don't want to put their own money. What I would think is a good test is what's commercial. So in energy efficiency, in particular, whether it's industrial or residential, there's a great return on investment. It doesn't cost, it pays. You obviously have to invest. But, a commercial payback of 5 to 7 years should be totally acceptable by commercial lenders. And so avoid paying for that but with public funds, but pay for the things that are longer term payback items or on a matching basis. Those are some of the tools and strategies to avoid that free ridership.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think this is a little bit challenging, right? Because you don't want to spend public money on things that are not going to happen, and yet the determination that they could happen and that the private money could make them happen, does that mean that they would happen anyway? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think so. There's just a bit of a balance there, and I think looking at what the additional pieces you can add with the public money is important. The other thing is just to do things like make sure that they're not things that are required by regulation or law, that they're extra beyond that. I think that's important to make them sort of additional.
Right. Well, we had a perfect example with one of the last rounds of the eco-energy program, where the government was providing incentives for high efficiency furnaces, when in fact high efficiency furnaces were basically out. Why would we provide, it was a regulatory requirement. We weren't allowed to manufacture them anymore. Okay, there were maybe some still floating around and there was a transition period, but really that wasn't something that we should be paying people to do. It's the law. So that's a very good example.
Mm-hmm. Thanks everyone. Keith, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Only that today was the first time I realized that all of the money in the environmental plan is going towards 4% of the emissions reductions in the plan. And I think that that's something that we need to interrogate in a little bit more detail and see if we can't, increase the amount of reductions that are supposed to come from this low carbon, or from the carbon trust rather, and also probably need to get some resources behind some of the other initiatives as well if they're going to deliver on their promise of emissions reductions.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. And just to remind everyone, you can give feedback and input into this plan, perhaps informed by this very webinar, by Monday, January 28th. You can find that on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, and you can submit your comments there. And watch your inboxes. If you are a Clean Economy Alliance member, you're going to find our draft submission in your inbox today. And it's very brief, but we appreciate your feedback on it. Well, I think that's it for now. Thank you so much to Justin Johnson and to Julia Langer for joining us today and helping us wrap our brains around this carbon trust and in a broader way, the environment plan. Thanks, everyone. Oh yeah, and you can find this will be the recording will be on our website probably within the week. So if you want to share this around with all your friends or you missed parts of it, you can find it there. Thanks.
Thank you.